Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The desert dusk stretched across the plains like a great, dying flame, its last embers glowing against the jagged ridges of the frontier. A lone rider moved across that vast emptiness, his silhouette etched in the fading orange light. His horse walked slow, hooves pressing softly into the sand, as though sensing the mood of the man on its back. Cole Haggerty had lived most of his 36 years under skies like these, wide, merciless, and stitched with the stories of men who had risen and fallen long before he ever rode them. But today, even this familiar sky felt heavier than usual, weighted by the empty space where a friend should have been. Buck, his dog, the one creature in this harsh, untamed land that had stayed loyal through ambushes, droughts, and long rides into nowhere. The dog had been gone 3 days now, disappearing into the canyons after a pack of coyotes during their journey back from the copper mines. Cole had searched through every ravine and every dry creek bed he could reach. The desert had answered him with nothing but wind. Now, with twilight crawling across the horizon, Cole turned back toward his homestead, small, lonely, perched at the edge of a narrow valley with nothing but juniper and dust for company. The world grew quieter as he approached, the only sound the heavy exhale of his horse and the soft jingle of the reins. The loneliness pressed harder when he dismounted, his boots settling into the dirt with a dull thud. It felt wrong coming home without Buck. That dog had always been there to greet him, even after nights when Cole returned battered and bruised from trouble he never asked for. The silence now was unbearable. He brushed down his horse, moving slow, as though delaying the moment he'd have to step inside the cabin and accept Buck's absence as real. Cole had lost things before, friends, family, pieces of his own hope. But losing Buck was different. He had become the last constant in a life that had shifted too many times. Cole walked toward the cabin, feeling the exhaustion of the day settle into his bones. The boards creaked beneath his weight, familiar and old. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cool stillness greeted him like a ghost. His hat hit the table with a hollow sound. For a long moment, Cole simply stood there, trying not to feel the ache in his chest. He lit a lamp, the flame flickering against the wooden walls, marked by years of dust storms and winter chill. On the mantel sat a small carved whistle, one he had used since Buck was a pup. He picked it up, turning it in his hand. Its edges were worn smooth from long use, and the feel of it stirred memories he wasn't ready to face. He lifted it to his lips and blew. The whistle cried out into the dusk, a long, sharp call that echoed into the vast emptiness outside. Cole waited. The night answered with nothing. He set the whistle down, jaw clenching as the truth pressed closer. The frontier was unforgiving. Things got taken by predators, by storms, by distance. Nothing stayed unless it fought hard to remain. Cole sat heavily in the lone chair near the hearth. He stared at the door, almost willing it to open. The wind howled faintly through the cracks, and he wondered if that lonely sound was all he would hear tonight. Hours seemed to pass as the lamp burned lower. Cole finally dozed, chin resting against his chest. The night shifted, and something in the stillness changed. A faint disturbance, soft, testing, like a presence approaching with hesitation. At first Cole didn't register it. But then a sound, a rustle just outside the door, a low, familiar whine. His eyes snapped open. The chair scraped back as he rose. In one motion, he crossed the room and threw open the door. There, standing in the dim wash of moonlight, was Buck. The dog was dusty, ribs heaving, fur tangled with burrs and dried mud, but his eyes, those dark, loyal eyes, were bright with recognition. Before Cole could even breathe, the dog bounded forward, pressing his weight into Cole's legs with a desperate, exhausted relief. Cole knelt, hands gripping Buck's neck, feeling the tremble of the dog's tired body. A sound escaped him, a choked breath he hadn't meant to release. He pressed his forehead to Buck's, letting the wave of gratitude wash through him. The dog pushed closer, tail wagging weakly, his body sinking as though the long journey had finally caught up with him. But then Cole felt it, a tension in Buck's posture, a glance over his shoulder. The dog pulled back slightly and turned toward the dark stretch of land beyond the homestead. Buck trotted a few paces, stopped, then looked back and barked, short, urgent. Cole's expression changed. He knew that bark, the dog wasn't just asking for water or comfort. Buck wanted him to follow. Cole grabbed his lamp and gun belt and stepped into the night, the desert chill biting at his skin. Buck moved ahead, pausing only to make sure Cole was behind him. They crossed the open yard and slipped into the narrow path leading toward the riverbed. Dry this time of year, but deep enough to hide anything or anyone. The night wrapped around them, thick and cold, as they descended a small slope. The moon cast pale light across the rocky ground, revealing tracks, multiple footprints, some small, some pressed deep from unsteady steps. Cole recognized them immediately. Not settlers, not ranch hands. Apache footsteps, light but careful, their pattern distinct. Buck slowed, ears pricked forward. Cole followed the dog's gaze. At the bottom of the ravine, leaning against a boulder, was a woman. Her long black hair spilled over her shoulders, tangled and dusty. Her clothing was worn, her skin marked by days of travel under a brutal sun. She sat still, breathing shallowly, one hand clutching her side. Her eyes lifted when she heard them approach, dark, wary, but shimmering with exhaustion. An Apache widow. Cole saw it instantly in the beads around her neck, the remnants of a mourning cloth torn and tied at her waist. She had walked far, too far for someone wounded and alone. Buck sat beside her, nudging her hand gently, as if urging Cole to help her. The truth fell into place with startling clarity. Buck had not just found his way home, he had led her to him. Cole crouched slowly, keeping his movements calm, respectful. The widow's eyes followed him, guarded but not fearful. She was too tired for fear now. He didn't speak. Words meant nothing here, not in her language, not in his. The silence between them held more truth than speech could bridge. Cole studied her wound, a gash along her ribs, crude cloth tied around it to stop the bleeding. She had likely been separated from her people, or forced to flee danger. The Apache lands were unpredictable lately, with skirmishes between rival groups and settlers pushing deeper into their territory. Buck pressed closer to her again, and Cole realized something else. The dog had been missing days. He must have found her out there somewhere, in trouble alone, and stayed by her side until she allowed him to guide her here. The desert had taken many things from Cole over the years, but tonight it had brought something unexpected. Cole lifted his lamp, illuminating the narrow ravine. There was no one else, no attackers, no tracks leading away. Just her, a widow crossing a land that wanted her gone. She needed shelter, water, rest, and the wound, if left untreated until morning, would worsen. Cole stood and extended a hand toward her, slow, unthreatening. She hesitated, pain flickering across her face, before finally placing her hand in his. Her grip was cold but steady. Cole guided her up the ravine, Buck walking proudly at her side, tail wagging in satisfaction. The widow stumbled once, and Cole caught her lightly, supporting her weight as they climbed. The cabin came into view, its lamplight glowing like a warm ember against the endless night. Inside, Cole prepared blankets and water, while Buck lay beside her, refusing to leave her side even for a moment. The woman watched every movement Cole made with quiet, weary eyes, as though unsure why a rancher would help someone like her. Cole didn't know the answer himself, but he knew this: the frontier had strange ways of crossing paths. And tonight, a lonely cowboy, a loyal dog, and a lost Apache widow had found themselves bound by something none of them could yet name. Outside, the desert wind shifted again, carrying the scent of coming change, and Cole knew this was only the beginning. The dawn crept slowly over the valley, casting pale gold across the rugged terrain that framed Cole Haggerty's homestead. The world stirred back to life beneath that soft light, but inside the cabin the air remained heavy and still, thick with the fragile quiet that follows danger. Cole watched the horizon through the small window, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle deeper in his chest. He had spent years living in solitude, learning to listen to the land, to the wind, to the quiet warnings a man learned to trust out here. This morning, the silence felt different. Behind him, the wounded Apache widow lay wrapped in blankets on the floor near the hearth. Her breathing was shallow but steadier than the night before. Buck rested beside her, alert even in sleep, as though guarding her from whatever trouble had driven her through the desert. Cole had cleaned her wound as best he could with the supplies he had: boiled water, a strip of torn cloth, medicinal herbs kept for emergencies. But he knew the desert could make a simple wound turn deadly if infection took hold. Still, she had survived through the night, and that alone felt like a sign. Cole moved quietly through the cabin, adding wood to the fire, warming water, grinding herbs. His movements were steady, shaped by years of self-reliance, but his mind wandered to questions he had no answers for. The widow had appeared out of nowhere alone, wounded and guided by a dog loyal enough to stay with her through whatever hell she'd walked from. Her arrival was no accident. The frontier did not deal in coincidences. Every path crossed for a reason, even if the reason stayed hidden for a time. As the fire crackled, Cole glanced back toward her. She stirred faintly, her brows tightening as though fighting off a memory. She looked younger now in the morning light, not in years but in fragility, like someone who had lost too much too quickly and now clung to what little remained. A mourning bead necklace hung around her throat, its dull shine telling the quiet truth Cole had already suspected. She had lost her husband. Apache widows wore no tears on their faces, only markers of grief woven into beads, leather, and silence. Outside, the wind began to rise, sweeping across the valley with a low whistle, carrying hints of dust from distant ridges. Cole stepped onto the porch, scanning the open land with the sharp gaze of a man who had survived too long by trusting his instincts. Tracks in the ravine, the widow's wound, her exhaustion, all signs pointed to more than simple misfortune. Something had happened out there, something violent, something close. Buck had known it too. The dog had stayed with the woman instead of returning immediately, a choice he had never made before. Buck was loyal, but he was also clever, and for him to abandon the trail home meant he had sensed danger or purpose greater than instinct. Cole's gaze swept the plain again, searching for movement, dust trails, or the glint of metal. Nothing. Just the endless expanse of land, deceptively calm beneath a sky still clearing from night. Inside the cabin, the widow shifted. Cole turned back, stepping through the doorway. She was awake now, though her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling as though uncertain whether she had drifted into a stranger's home or dream. Her body tensed slightly when she realized she was not alone, but her gaze softened when she saw Buck rise to his feet, tail wagging softly. Cole moved slowly to kneel beside the hearth, giving her space, showing no threat. He lifted the pot of warm water and set out more herbs. The widow watched him with a guarded stillness, studying his every motion. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence held stories heavier than words. The morning stretched on, and Cole continued tending to her wound. The air in the cabin remained quiet, except for the faint crackle of fire and Buck's steady breathing. Cole had never been a man who relied on conversation. Life on the frontier hardened a man into valuing silence almost more than speech. But this silence felt different, thicker, as though layered with grief and uncertainty. As Cole pressed fresh herbs against the wound, the widow winced, but her gaze remained steady. She did not pull away. Her resilience reminded him of something he had seen many times among Apache women: strength carved by survival, spirits shaped by the unforgiving demands of the land. He could not help but wonder what had driven her into the night so wounded and alone. By mid-morning, the sky brightened into relentless blue, the kind that warned of another long, hot day. Cole stepped outside again, scanning the land once more. Something in his bones told him trouble was not far behind. The Apache territories lay miles northeast, but conflicts between tribes and settlers had been stirring recently, rumors carried by passing riders and drifting through small towns like dust in wind. Men thirsty for land, men hungry for vengeance, men chasing shadows of fear they did not understand. Those tensions often spilled into violence. Cole knew enough of the Apache ways to know a widow did not wander alone without reason. She should have been surrounded by her people, protected, watched over. That she reached him instead meant something had gone terribly wrong. The sun climbed higher. The heat pressed down on the earth, settling into the cracks of the valley and drawing insects from their hiding places. Cole wiped sweat from his brow, feeling the unease twist tighter in his chest. When he returned inside, the widow had pulled herself to a sitting position, though her body trembled with effort. Buck stood beside her, nudging her gently as though reminding her not to move too quickly. Cole approached slowly, and she watched him with the same unwavering gaze, her breathing shallow but steady. She lifted one hand, fingers grazing the mourning beads at her neck. That single gesture answered more than words could have. She had not simply lost her husband, she had lost him violently. Cole sat across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. Outside, the wind gusted hard, rattling the loose boards of the cabin. The sound reminded him of distant storms, those that brewed beyond sight, but carried the power to reshape the land once they arrived. This felt the same. He did not know her story. He did not know what danger trailed her footsteps. But as she met his gaze with the quiet weight of someone who had been hunted, not simply lost, Cole understood that whatever had driven her here was not finished. The frontier did not let its stories end easily. Hours passed, and the widow drifted in and out of rest. Cole remained close enough to tend to her, but far enough not to crowd her. Her presence changed the cabin in ways he had not expected. The space felt less empty somehow, though the uncertainty hung like a shadow against the walls. By late afternoon, faint thunder rumbled across the distant mountains, though the sky remained clear. Cole stood on the porch, sensing the shift in the air. Storms on the frontier did not always come from clouds. They came from men, from conflict, from the kind of trouble that left widows wandering alone. Buck emerged beside him, hackles lifted, ears pricked toward the northern ridge. The dog's sudden alertness sent a chill through Cole despite the heat. He scanned the horizon. There it was, a thin coil of dust rising beyond the far hills, a sign of riders. Several moving fast. Cole stepped back into the cabin and reached for his rifle, not with the intention to fight, but to prepare. The widow sensed the change instantly. Her eyes followed his movements, and her hand tightened around the blanket draped over her legs. The dust cloud grew thicker, closer. Whatever had driven the widow into Cole's life had now found her trail, and it was coming straight for them. The wind rose with a sharp, uneasy whistle as the line of dust drew closer from the northern ridge. The land stretched open and vulnerable beneath the vast sky, and every ripple of movement echoed across the valley like an approaching storm. Cole Haggerty stood at the porch's edge, rifle resting loosely in his hand, though not out of an eagerness to use it. The frontier had taught him that raising a weapon often drew more death than it prevented. Still, he had lived long enough to know that trouble did not stop simply because a man wished it would. Buck paced back and forth at Cole's side, muscles tight, ears angled toward the ridge. The dog sensed the danger long before the tracks grew visible, his instincts sharper than any man's. Inside the cabin, the Apache widow sat upright now, her breathing tense with the instinctive awareness of someone who had been hunted across miles of unforgiving land. Her eyes flickered to the open door again and again, as though expecting the riders to burst into the valley at any moment. The dust cloud stretched wider, telling Cole there were more riders than he'd first guessed. 5, maybe 6. Men moving with purpose, not wandering aimlessly like ranch hands or traders. Their direction, too, was too direct to be accidental. They were following a trail, fresh, unmistakable. They were following her. Cole stepped off the porch and moved toward the far edge of the property, where a small rise of earth offered a vantage point. From there he watched the figures emerge, one by one, as they crested the ridge, dark silhouettes against the morning sun. Their horses moved in a tight formation, kicking up dust from the dry earth. These were not Apache riders. Cole recognized the posture, the gear, the way the horses were handled. These were frontier mercenaries, men who sold their guns to whoever paid best. Men who hunted more often for coin than for justice. Their presence explained the widow's flight, the wound she carried, and the terror hidden beneath her calm gaze. Mercenaries had no loyalty and even less mercy. They chased bounties, grudges, or stolen claims without care for the blood spilled along the way. Cole felt a weight settle deeper in his chest. He had not asked for this. He had not sought out their trouble. But the widow had been brought to his doorstep by fate, or by Buck's stubborn loyalty, so now he was part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. The riders halted at the ridge, scanning the valley. Cole knew they could not yet see him clearly from that distance, but they would soon. The tracks from last night, the footprints, the marks in the ravine, would lead them straight down into the hollow where his homestead stood. Cole returned to the cabin, his boots heavy on the cracked earth. The widow met his gaze the moment he stepped inside. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating the tension in her features. She watched him with an expression that held both warning and acceptance, as though she expected no help from him, as though she assumed he would turn her out to face whatever waited beyond the hills. But Cole had never been a man to throw someone back into danger once they'd crossed his threshold, not even someone the world deemed enemy or stranger. The frontier took enough lives without his adding to it. He set his rifle on the table and moved to the window, pulling down the leather cover he rarely used. The widow watched every motion. Buck remained by the door, tail still, his entire body rigid with alarm. Cole studied the room, mentally measuring its vulnerabilities. The cabin was sturdy but old, with walls that had seen too many winters. It would not hold against gunfire, nor was it meant to. The homestead was built for living, not fighting. He turned toward the woman, her hand pressed lightly over her wound, but her eyes held steady. She understood the danger. She understood what the approaching riders meant. She had likely seen them before. perhaps as they rushed into her people's camp, or as they hunted whatever they thought belonged to them. She had run, and she had lost everything in the running. The fire crackled softly, its warmth clashing with the cold dread creeping through the room. Cole moved toward a small storage chest beneath his workbench and pulled out a leather pouch, the contents rattling faintly. It held the few valuables he owned, but more importantly, a map of the land surrounding his property. The mountains, the dry riverbeds, the hidden passes, the canyon trails known only to those who lived through seasons of storms and scarcity. There were places she could hide, places the riders would take hours, maybe days to search, but hiding her meant drawing the mercenary's wrath onto himself. Cole weighed that truth quietly, feeling the world narrow into a heavy stillness. The widow's presence had already set fate into motion. He could turn her out and hope they didn't stop long enough to ask questions, or he could step fully into her struggle, risking the life he had carved out in solitude. Buck approached and nudged Cole's hand, as though sensing the decision forming inside him. The riders were closer now. Their shadows grew longer across the ridge. Cole walked outside again, watching them descend into the valley. The horses moved at a steady trot, stirring more dust into the air. The sun glinted off metal rifles, revolvers, and blades strapped to their saddles. He could see their faces now, hard men, sunburned skin, eyes narrow from years of living at the edge of violence. They spread out slightly, scanning the land with the precision of hunters who had followed far too many desperate trails to misread the signs. Cole's mind sharpened, choices dwindled, danger thickened in the air like storm clouds gathering above a parched canyon. The riders slowed as they reached the dry riverbed. They dismounted, crouching to study the disturbed earth. Cole's jaw tightened. They had found the tracks. Buck growled low. Cole stepped back into the cabin and closed the door gently. The widow sat still, but her posture remained tense, as though every muscle in her body were poised to flee again despite the wound tearing at her side. The riders had not fired a shot yet. They had not called out. That meant they were not interested in negotiation. They intended to approach quietly, catch whoever they sought by surprise, and take what they wanted without witnesses. Cole's homestead, isolated and open, stood like a beacon for trouble, a lone cabin in the valley, an easy target. They would search it, they would examine every track leading to it, and they would expect the man who lived there to obey the law of fear they carried with them. The widow's eyes met his. They held a question unspoken but heavy. Would he hide her? Would he protect her? Would he risk everything for someone he did not know? Cole felt an unfamiliar heat surge beneath his ribs, a blend of anger at the rider's cruelty and something deeper, a sense that this widow belonged to a story larger than her suffering. That fate had twisted the land just enough to bring her into his care, and that turning away from that responsibility would make him no better than the men closing in. He stepped toward her and motioned subtly toward the back of the cabin, toward the hidden hatch beneath the floorboards where he stored winter supplies. A narrow space, but safe, concealed, cool, protected, she understood. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet, leaning heavily on the wall as she moved. Buck stayed beside her, guiding her steps. Outside, the horses stopped. Boots hit the ground. They were here. Cole lifted the hatch. The widow descended into the darkness, her breath trembling but steady. Buck remained above, torn between loyalty to her and the instinct to defend Cole. Cole motioned him down. The dog hesitated, then obeyed, slipping into the shadows with her. The hatch closed. The cabin fell silent. Footsteps approached the porch. Cole tightened his grip on his rifle, not in aggression, but in readiness. The frontier often judged a man by whether he stood or fled. The rider's boots hit the first step. The storm had arrived. The rider's boots struck the porch with the heavy rhythm of men who expected no resistance. The planks creaked beneath their weight, each footstep a stark reminder that the peace of Cole Haggerty's valley had come to an abrupt, unwelcome end. Inside the cabin, the air thickened with the weight of approaching danger. Cole stood alone in the center of the room, rifle in hand, his breath steady despite the tension coiling through his muscles. Below the floorboards, hidden in the cramped darkness of the storage chamber, the Apache widow and Buck remained still. The space was narrow and cold, but it held safety, at least for a moment. The widow's breath caught quietly in her throat, her fingers brushing the old wooden beams above her head. Buck pressed against her side, the faint rise and fall of his chest a comfort in the suffocating dark. Above them the riders paused on the porch. The silence carried a sharp cruelty, the kind found only in men who enjoyed the fear they caused. Cole shifted his stance, stepping away from the hatch without glancing toward it. He moved instead toward the table, where his hands could rest in a calm, unthreatening manner. He knew the riders would break the door down if he did not meet them on his feet, but he also knew greeting them with fear or with raised steel would only escalate the violence waiting outside. The first knock came hard, more a demand than a request. It echoed through the timber frame, vibrating through the floorboards and into the hollow space below. The widow flinched at the sound, her wound throbbing from the sharp jolt of movement. Buck nudged against her gently, urging her to remain still. The knock came again, harder, bolder. Dust fell from the rafters. Cole breathed slowly, walked forward, and unlatched the door. The riders stood in a loose half-circle on the porch, their horses tethered a short distance behind them. Sunburnt faces, wind, cracked lips, cold eyes that had seen too much and cared too little. Their leader stood at the front, broad shoulders, a coat frayed from years of violence, a scar running from brow to cheek, like a jagged reminder of the life he led. Cole stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him with careful intention. He needed their attention on him and nowhere else. The leader's gaze swept over Cole, searching for weakness or guilt or the slightest hint of concealed truth. His men fanned out, peering toward the barn, the hills, the small lean-to near the water barrels. They scoured everything except the calm, quiet man standing before them. The land held its breath. The leader stepped closer, his boots grinding into the dirt. His eyes narrowed as he searched Cole's expression for something he didn't yet understand. Cole remained still, his posture relaxed but ready, his gaze steady. His rifle remained inside, propped against the wall, though every instinct begged him to keep it close. The mercenary leader's hand hovered near his gun, a silent threat hanging between them. His men shifted restlessly, eyeing the cabin with suspicion. The dust on the riders' coats told Cole they had been traveling fast, likely pushing their horses hard through the night. Men who rode with that kind of urgency did not leave empty-handed. He stayed calm. The frontier had taught him that some men were more animal than human, driven by hunger, greed, or rage. If he showed even a spark of fear, they would bare their teeth. The minutes stretched long and tense. Cole answered their unspoken questions with the quiet steadiness of someone who had nothing to hide. His eyes remained calm, his breathing slow, his stance unyielding. The riders searched for cracks in his composure, signs of hidden guilt, but found only the steady presence of a man accustomed to solitude and hardship. Below the floorboards, the widow listened to the muffled thuds of boots on wood. She could feel the vibrations through the cold earth beneath her. Every step the men took sent echoes through her bones. She clutched the mourning beads at her neck gently, grounding herself against the fear rising in her chest. She feared not only for herself, but for the man who now stood between her and danger. Buck lay pressed against her side, his ears pricked and body tense. The dog's silence impressed her. Instinct told him danger was near, and he obeyed Cole's command to stay hidden without a sound. She rested one hand on Buck's fur, feeling strength in the animal's quiet resolve. Above them, the riders grew impatient. Their boots thudded across the porch again, then faded as they moved around the cabin, kicking dust, kicking stones, searching for signs of a second presence. They looked for tracks that might belong to someone other than Cole. Their frustration grew as they found none. Cole had erased signs of the widow's arrival in the early morning before the riders came, smoothing disturbed footprints, scattering loose dirt, sweeping away the prints left from last night. Careful trek. The leader circled the cabin one last time, suspicious but uncertain. He paused near the window, scanning the interior through a narrow crack. The room appeared empty, one man's humble space, quiet and unremarkable. No signs of struggle, no blood. No supplies missing, no evidence of another person, yet his instincts told him she was close. Meanwhile, Cole felt their scrutiny weighing on him, but he didn't waver. He stood as unmoved as the old juniper tree behind his barn, deep-rooted and steady. Eventually, the mercenary leader stepped back toward his horse. His men exchanged glances, waiting for orders. The leader's hand rested on his saddle horn for a long, tense moment. He surveyed the valley, the homestead, and finally the rancher standing before him. Something in Cole's expression, something calm, unswayed, finally convinced him to pull back. But not away, not fully. The riders mounted their horses, dust swirling beneath pounding hooves. They did not ride far. Instead, they took up position along the ridge overlooking the valley, watching the homestead like wolves circling prey. They were waiting, watching, certain that eventually, whoever they chased would emerge. The valley fell into a strained hush as the sound of hooves faded. Cole stepped back inside the cabin, his chest tight with the knowledge that the danger had not passed, only lurked. He closed the door gently and lifted the hatch. The widow blinked up at him from the shadows, her body trembling with exhaustion and the weight of fear she had held inside. She steadied herself as he helped her climb out, her movements slow but determined. Buck scrambled up behind her, shaking the dust from his coat. The room felt heavier now, burdened by the quiet truth they all shared. The riders would not leave. Not until they had what they came for. Not until they found her. The widow sank onto the blankets near the hearth, her shoulders slumping beneath invisible weight. Cole moved to the window, peering through the narrow slit in the leather cover. The riders remained on the ridge, distant but dangerous, like storm clouds forming on the horizon. The land no longer felt safe. The valley no longer felt like home. This was no longer merely a wounded woman in need of shelter. This had become a crossroads, a collision of lives shaped by loss, survival, and the silent bonds forming stronger than either of them expected. Cole understood then that he could not stay here, nor could she. The riders would return, and next time they would not be asking questions. A choice had to be made, one that would shape the next steps of their journey, and whatever choice it was, the desert would test it. The sun dipped low behind the jagged line of distant mesas, casting long shadows through the valley as Cole Haggerty prepared for a journey he had not expected to take. The homestead stood quiet behind him, its familiar comforts now weighed down by danger. The Apache widow rested near the hearth, her eyes half open, watching the rancher move with purpose. Every action he took, packing water skins, rolling blankets, gathering dried meat, was slow but certain, shaped by a decision made not in haste but necessity. The mercenaries had not left the ridge since their arrival. They watched the cabin from afar, waiting like vultures circling a wounded animal. Their patience revealed their intent. They were determined to capture the widow, and they believed time was on their side. But the frontier did not reward those who waited. It rewarded those who moved. Cole understood that staying meant surrendering her, and surrender would mean death. As the sky darkened, a cold wind moved through the valley, stirring dust across the yard and rattling loose boards. Night crept closer, offering the only cover they were likely to get. Cole paused at the window, watching the faint silhouettes of the riders on the distant ridge. The glow of their small campfire flickered like a watching eye. Buck paced in tight circles near the door, ears drawn flat in anxious anticipation. He sensed the shift, the urgency, the peril. The Apache widow watched Cole with quiet understanding, her survival instincts strong despite her weakness. She did not ask for assurance, only nodded faintly, accepting that her fate now intertwined with his. Cole approached her, kneeling beside her with the careful respect he had shown since she arrived. He lifted the leather satchel he had prepared, securing its strap across her shoulder so it would not fall during the journey. The widow winced as the motion tugged at her healing wound, but she made no sound. Determination hardened her expression, revealing the depth of courage that had carried her across miles of relentless desert. Buck paused beside her, gazing up at her with unwavering devotion. She rested her hand on his head, grateful for the animal who had saved her life twice now, first by finding her, then by refusing to leave her side. Cole extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. Only the embers of the dying fire glowed faintly, casting dim orange light across the wooden floor. Darkness wrapped around them like a cloak, shielding their movements from curious eyes beyond the walls. Outside, the night stretched long and silent, broken only by the distant howl of a lone coyote. Cole guided the widow toward the back door, the one hidden from the ridge's view. It opened into the brush, covered slope that led toward the deep canyon's rugged terrain that could swallow footprints and conceal travelers from anyone unprepared to navigate its labyrinth. The widow steadied herself against the doorway as she stepped into the cool night air. Her breath fogged slightly in the cold. Cole checked the ridge again. No movement. The mercenaries were still seated around their fire, embers faint in the vast dark. Perhaps they believed the widow too weak to travel. Perhaps they believed Cole too cautious to risk a nighttime escape. Perhaps they believed they had already won. Cole and the widow slipped into the darkness, Buck walking ahead to scout the trail. The land sloped downward toward the canyons, where cliffs jutted upward like silent guardians. Stars glimmered in the sky, bright and sharp, guiding them along paths that only seasoned riders or desperate souls dared to take. The widow stumbled once, and Cole steadied her carefully. She moved slowly, but her resolve never faltered. Every step she took was deliberate, driven by a need deeper than fear. Survival, yes, but also dignity. She carried the weight of her tribe, her loss, her widowhood, in every strained breath. The silence between them held them together more tightly than words could have. The land around them shifted from open valley to narrow trails, the canyon walls rising high, swallowing the moonlight and replacing it with deep shadows. Crickets sang from hidden crevices. The cold air clung to their skin, stealing warmth. Cole paused often to listen. Hawks screeching from afar, stones tumbling down the slopes, the distant groan of wind passing through narrow rock channels. But he did not hear horses. Not yet. They reached a fork in the canyon where the land branched into two separate paths, one leading deeper into the twisting labyrinth, the other toward the dry riverbed that wound through the backlands. Cole considered the routes carefully. The mercenaries would likely assume he would choose the narrower canyons, believing the terrain too hazardous for someone escorting a wounded woman. That made the riverbed safer, though longer. He guided the widow toward the riverbed, helping her descend a steep embankment. Loose gravel slid beneath their boots, causing them to crouch low to avoid falling. Buck navigated ahead, sniffing at unfamiliar scents carried by the breeze. The dry riverbed stretched before them, a winding path of pale sand and stone, illuminated faintly by the stars. The canyon walls towered high above, their shapes carved by centuries of storms. The widow paused to rest, leaning heavily on a boulder. Cole watched her chest rise and fall, strained but steady. Time was their enemy, yet he resisted the urge to rush her. A hurried escape would turn into a dead one. A soft breeze carried the faint smell of campfire smoke, but not from his cabin. Cole's breath caught sharply. The mercenaries had moved. Some had stayed on the ridge. Others had followed the canyon. He motioned urgently to Buck. The dog froze, ears sharp, analyzing the scent. The widow steadied herself, her eyes narrowing with recognition. Her people had been hunted before. She knew the smell of men closing in. Cole led them deeper along the riverbed, choosing a narrow path where fallen rocks created natural cover. He pressed a hand to the widow's back, guiding her gently toward the shadows. Buck pressed close beside them, refusing to leave her. Above them, on the canyon rim, faint silhouettes moved, at first only one, then another. They crawled along the edge like predators tracking wounded prey. Cole pulled the widow tight against the wall, shielding her as best he could from sight. The mercenaries' voices drifted down in rough, indistinct murmurs. The widow listened, her body tense, her gaze darkening as she heard the tone of men who had once invaded her camp, killed those she loved, and tore apart the world she knew. Her fingers brushed the mourning beads around her neck, symbols of grief, yes, but also strength. The footsteps above them moved on, fading into the distance. But Cole knew it was only a matter of time before they circled back. They were not far. The escape window was closing. They pressed deeper into the canyon, moving carefully through shadows and narrow passages. Hours passed slowly, marked by the shifting stars and the faint chill that crept into their bones. The widow stumbled often, but she did not collapse. She pressed forward, driven by a strength beyond simple endurance. At last, they reached a hidden alcove, a small cave carved into the canyon wall, invisible unless one stood directly before it. Cole had discovered it years ago while tracking lost cattle. It had become a refuge only he and Buck knew of. He guided the widow inside. The cave was small, but deep enough to conceal them fully. The air was cold, but safe. The widow sank to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. Buck curled beside her, keeping her warm with his fur. Cole positioned himself near the entrance, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes never leaving the canyon mouth. The mercenaries were near, too near, but for the moment, in the cold shelter of the rock, the widow was safe. The final confrontation still loomed ahead, inevitable, dangerous, and close. Night stretched onward, heavy with dread and the promise of a fate that would break or bind them forever. The dawn that rose over the high ridges felt different from any morning before it. The air carried a quiet that was not empty but full of the echoes of everything that had happened, and everything that was about to change. The cowboy felt it the moment he stepped out of the cabin. It was as though the land itself had paused to breathe, waiting to see what choices would be made on this final stretch of their long, winding journey. In the soft morning light, the cowboy saw the Apache widow standing near the edge of the clearing. She was finally strong again, her posture steady, her expression calm. The injuries that once weighed on her had healed into thin scars that traced their stories across her skin. She stood with her face toward the sun, her eyes half closed as if greeting a familiar spirit. Near her feet, the dog rested quietly, watching her with gentle devotion. For the first time since he had found her in the wilderness, she no longer looked lost. Instead, she looked prepared. The cowboy understood that the moment he had dreaded was now close, the moment when she would choose where her path would lead. And though he did not speak the words aloud, he feared that path might not include him. The night before had been long and reflective for them both. The cowboy had sat near the fire for hours, replaying the hardships and victories they had shared, the days battling the storm, the nights listening for threats in the dark, the struggle against the raiders, the endless travel, the shared grief of loss, and the quiet companionship that had slowly become something deeper. He realized he could no longer pretend that his life had not changed forever. He would never be the same lonely ranch hand he had been before his dog went missing and returned with the wounded widow trailing behind. Now, with the sun pushing its way over the horizon, he knew this was a turning point. Whether or not they remained together, this day would shape the rest of their lives. The widow stepped toward him, walking with a calm certainty. Her eyes held strength, the kind earned through loss, endurance, and survival. She approached the cabin, touched the wooden frame gently, almost as if giving thanks for the shelter it had provided her. Then she moved closer to him, standing within arm's reach, quiet yet purposeful. She lifted her gaze to the mountains in the distance. The cowboy followed her eyes and understood the meaning immediately. The mountains marked the direction of her tribe, the direction of her people, the direction of everything she had ever known. It was time. She began preparing for travel that morning, not with haste or fear, but with the serene focus of someone ready to face the world again. She checked the gear they had gathered, packed food and tools, and secured her belongings with care. Every movement told the cowboy that she was determined to return to her homeland, to find the remnants of her tribe, or at least to honor them if she discovered none remained. The cowboy, though quiet, helped where he could. He saddled the horses and ensured each saddlebag was thoroughly stocked. He double-checked every strap and knot, making sure not even the smallest detail was overlooked. It was all he could think to do, offer the practical help of a man who wished he could offer more. When she finished preparing, she walked to the dog and knelt beside him. She placed her hand gently on the dog's head, brushing his fur with gratitude. The animal leaned against her, sensing the significance of the moment. Then he turned his eyes toward the cowboy, as if asking him whether he understood what was unfolding. The cowboy nodded faintly. He understood more than he wished to. The widow then turned to look at the open expanse ahead, the path that would take her into the mountains. She walked forward a few paces, stopping at the boundary where the clearing vanished into wilderness. The cowboy felt his heart tighten, knowing she might ride away at any moment and that he would have to accept it. But the widow didn't mount her horse right away. Instead, she turned back to him and waited in a way that carried a question deeper than words could ever hold. The cowboy realized then that he had a choice too. He could stay behind, return to his solitary life, and let the memory of their journey become nothing more than a chapter of his past. Or he could follow her into the unknown, into a land far from his comfort and his ranching life. It would be a step into a world few cowboys ever dared to tread, a world bound by traditions unfamiliar to him, and trials he could not predict. But he also knew that the world ahead, strange and untamed as it was, held something the world behind him did not. A future shaped by connection, companionship, and the quiet hope he had long thought impossible. With a slow breath, the cowboy approached his horse. He placed one hand on the saddle horn, feeling the familiar worn leather beneath his palm. He hesitated only for a moment before lifting himself into the saddle. His decision was not made out of impulse, but out of the steady, undeniable truth that had grown inside him over their long road. He did not want to be apart from her. The widow watched him mount his horse, and a subtle warmth entered her expression, a look filled with understanding and acceptance. She did not need to speak, nor did he. The decision had already bridged the space between them. Together, they guided their horses toward the mountain path. The dog trotted at their side, tail swaying with a sense of purpose, as though he knew he had once again completed an important mission, not one of finding a lost companion this time, but of creating a bond that would carry all three into a new chapter of life. As they rode, the landscape began to shift. The open plains gradually rose into rugged slopes stitched with pine and boulder. The wind that swept down from the peaks carried scents of wild mint, cedar, and melting snow. They moved in unhurried harmony, side by side, matching each other's pace without effort. The quiet between them was not empty. It was rich, filled with the silent trust of two souls who had walked through danger and heartbreak, and had come out stronger for it. Hours passed before they stopped to rest near a high ridge overlooking the valley they had left behind. The cowboy dismounted and stood at the edge, gazing at the land that had once been the entirety of his world. Now it seemed small in comparison to the expanses of possibility waiting ahead. The widow stood beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. Together, they looked back on the past one last time before turning toward the future. The dog barked once, sharp and bright, breaking the stillness as if announcing the final shift in their journey. They both smiled softly, silent acknowledgment of the loyal companion who had brought them together in the first place. With the sun dropping toward the horizon, the trio continued their ascent into the mountains. The path was steep, the air thin, but neither cowboy nor widow showed hesitation. They rode with unwavering resolve, knowing that whatever waited on the other side, whether it was a reunion, a new life, or challenges yet unknown, they would face it together. As the last rays of daylight painted the sky in fierce streaks of gold and crimson, they disappeared into the high wilderness as a united family forged not by blood, but by fate, resilience, and the quiet kind of love that grows between people who have endured the harshest trials side by side. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more. The widow was lost no longer, and the dog, who had once vanished into the storm, had found his way home in the truest sense, by leading them both to each other. The story ends here, but their journey continues beyond the frontier, into a future shaped by courage, heart, and the wild, unbroken promise of the American West.